All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to my latest course on criminal justice. And this time we are going to do comparative criminology, which is, overall the art and science of comparing two different places and how they compare based on criminal justice, i.e., policing, courts, corrections, law, those sort of areas. So, for those of you, if this is the first course of mine you've seen, I'm Dr. Kevin W. Jennings. I have my PhD in criminal justice, and I am very excited to be able to bring you this course, and I'm always willing to hear feedback, so please message me or get in touch, and I would love to hear comments, corrections, suggestions, or just fan mail or hate mail, Anyway, let's get started. So, first off, if this is your first criminal justice course you've ever taken, we got to do a very brief discussion of what exactly is meant by criminal justice. And criminal justice is essentially the academic study of the organizations that every society has to create or maintain social control, right? Hundreds of years ago, philosophers talked about the social contract, right? We as humans want to live in societies. Societies give us lots and lots of benefits that living alone or with very small family groups would not. And in return, we have to give up some of our rights, our liberties, our ability to take whatever we want, our ability to do whatever we want. So every society from hunter-gatherer tribes all the way on up to modern first world nations needs some form of social control. And the criminal justice system in every society is the system designed to maintain that social control. And it's both processes and institutions, i.e., it's both verbs and nouns. It's how do we do things plus police officers and courtrooms and stuff. In addition to both the noun and the verb thing, it's also the people and the social context, right? So the criminal justice system in the United States might be vastly different from the criminal justice system in Japan, not just because the processes and institutions are different, but because the people are very different and the social context is very different. So over time or over geography, social context is constantly changing and it's different place to place and time to time. And you have to take those things into account when looking at any real criminal justice system, past, present, or future, here where I am in the United States, or in the Philippines, or in South Africa, or wherever, right? And the three big areas that people usually talk about within criminal justice are police, courts, and corrections, right? Those are kind of the three big chunks that most criminal justice textbooks and lecturers will talk about. But there's also kind of an other category, right? Because there's other ways we create and maintain social control that are kind of related to those, but not quite related to those, right? For instance, private security. That is a tool to maintain social control, but it's not any of the three categories above. And we're going to talk more about this and how all this kind of can be studied in a comparative context over the course of this entire course. So, now that we've talked a little bit about what criminal justice is, what do we mean when we say comparative criminal justice? So comparative criminal justice means taking two different places or the same place in two different times and talking about what are the differences, what are the similarities. But the point of doing this is kind of threefold. Number one, to highlight problems, right? If country A has a really high crime rate and country B has a really low crime rate, we need to kind of point out that, hey, country A is doing something wrong. Country B has something happening that allows them to do the whole social control thing kind of better, right? So we need to highlight these problems and issues and places where improvement can be made. And then suggest solutions, right? It's not enough to just say, oh, country A has a much higher crime rate than country B. We also have to suggest solutions. We could say things like, well, country B, they have this program to reduce alcohol and drug consumption. or country B has police officers that are trained and able to do this other method or philosophy on policing. So it's not enough to just say Group A is doing it wrong. We need to say, hey, we could possibly fix that problem. We could possibly at least make it better. Maybe not fix the entire problem, but make it a little bit better, make it a little bit more, make the social control process happen a little better, a little more efficiently, if we get these ideas from this other group or this group over here, or something like that. And then finally, there's dismantling myths. I have talked to so many people, both in my normal life and in my professional life, who are just wildly misinformed about criminal justice here in the United States, but also in other countries. So it's kind of getting people to realize that a lot of what they've been taught is wrong, especially about the criminal justice system, is a very important part of all criminal justice education in my mind. But honestly, kind of even more so important within a comparative context. Now, when we're talking about these systems, right, whether it's the modern American justice system or the system in the European Union or whatever, it's really, really important to look at the social, cultural, political, and or religious foundations of that process, right? Because no part of the legal system, no part of the criminal justice system was created in a vacuum, right? There's a reason police in the United States carry guns and police in the UK don't, normally. That is a social, cultural, political, and religious development that happened many, 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 many years ago, and took, over the process of hundreds of years. But it's important to understand that process and that kind of foundation for why police in the United States and police in the UK look very different when it comes to weapons and even armor and things like that. One of the things that makes this a little more complicated was the process of colonization. And we're going to talk about that a lot more in a future section. But in the kind of, 15th through 19th centuries, kind of England, France, Belgium, Italy, Spain, all those countries colonized a huge chunk of the world and set up criminal justice systems that looked very much like what they had at home. So it was this kind of involuntary exporting of Western European criminal justice solutions to countries all over the planet. And that means that most of the modern countries here in the 21st century have some kind of link to a Western European criminal justice system. Because at some point, pretty much most of the world was colonized by a Western European country. Either, most of it directly, kind of militarily direct colonization, but there's also kind of the process of social colonization, i.e. American movies are seen all over the world. So in American movies, if they do it one way, people kind of start expecting it to be done that way in their part of the world. But we'll talk all about that and the process of both, traditional colonization and colonization through kind of the media and the culture later on. So what are the goals of comparative criminal justice? Well, we need to have some kind of cooperation, right? Because our world is getting closer and closer and closer together. Travel times have gone down, costs of travel have gone down. The internet has made every country kind of borderless in a lot of ways. The globe is becoming easier and easier and easier to traverse and to commit crimes in. And thus, we need to start cooperating. If we're going to have this process of social control, We need to cooperate. We need to make sure that everybody's working together to kind of catch bad guys and protect innocents. I hate to sound kind of basic, but that's what it boils down to. With that cooperation, we need to have a global impact on crime, right? Because crime has a global impact on us, again, especially the field of cybercrime. But we need to have a global impact back, right? Because of things like environmental crime, right? If one country, a company commits a huge environmental crime and dumps tons and tons and tons of toxic sludge into the oceans, that doesn't just affect that country, that affects the rest of the world. So because crime has a global impact, we need to kind of have an effect on that back. And then finally, there's preventing ethnocentrism, right? Ethnocentrism is kind of the belief that we're the best and everybody else sucks. Lots of people in every country believe that. But it's kind of damaging. We need to all realize that we can all learn from each other, right? Just because we've done it a certain way doesn't mean that's the right way, doesn't mean it's the only way. We can absolutely learn from each other, and everybody's doing something better than your country is. We can all kind of increase that ability to see other countries as just as capable, just as smart, just as proud, and just as capable of having a good idea about how to fight crime. Now, when we're talking about comparative criminal justice, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is kind of comparing country to country. But that's not necessarily the only thing we can do within a comparative context. We can also compare states or provinces, right? The United States, we're famous for having 50 different states. And each one of those 50 different states has a vastly different criminal justice system. I could do an entire course just about the differences from state to state to state in the United States about their policing and court systems and correction systems and all those things. Then you can compare city to city, right? Maybe within one state you want to talk about comparing, say, Houston, Texas and Dallas, Texas. They're both very large cities in the same U.S. state. You could even go so far as to compare neighborhoods, right? Why is this neighborhood in this one city have so much more crime than this other neighborhood in the same city? So we can compare at really any level of geographic measurement you want. Again, kind of the most famous, the one that gets the most attention, both in the field, I think, and within this course, is going to be comparing country to country. But again, that's not the only thing. And it's still just as useful to talk about, say, crime in the American South versus the American West, or crime on the East Coast of Canada versus the West Coast of Canada. Things like that are still perfectly valid comparative areas of study. So what are the hard parts? Well, we're going to be going over this probably in most of the sections throughout this course. I'm going to reiterate a lot of these difficulties in really comparing two different areas. The first is definitions, right? We don't define homicide the same way in the United States as they do in China. We don't define burglary in one state in the United States the same way they do in another state. So because those definitions change, can be very misleading to try to compare the homicide rate in the United States versus the homicide rate in China, because since the definitions are different, it's not giving you an apples to apples comparison, right? So there's also misleading comparisons. And one of my favorite examples of this isn't actually from the field of criminal justice, but it's SAT scores in Mississippi versus Massachusetts. And the average SAT score in Mississippi is much higher than the average SAT score in Massachusetts, which many people can use to say, oh, well, in the high school education system in Mississippi is obviously better. They're getting higher scores on the SAT. And for those who don't know, the SAT is the test you take after graduating high school or soon before graduating high school. And then you send your scores to prospective colleges, and they can do their admissions based on your score on this test. So it's a nationwide kind of general education exam that the United States gives to most of its high school graduates. But the misleading comparison part comes in when you look at who takes the SAT. In Mississippi, it's a very, very low percentage of their students take the SAT, i.e. only the really smart ones who are wanting to get into colleges that require SAT scores are taking that exam. Whereas in Massachusetts, almost everybody takes it. So not only the really smart students are taking it, but also the less accomplished students are taking it. So of course that's going to bring the state's average score down. So when you're comparing two things, you need to kind of be careful about making sure you're comparing apples to apples. Record keeping can also be a problem, right? There are many places in the United States where the record keeping is not the best. And there are other places where they're really, really good at record keeping, and they have data on crime, on lots of different crimes going back decades or even 100 years or more. And then there are some places in the world where they don't keep very good records, either because they don't see the value in it, or because they don't have the money, or lots of different reasons. But especially when you're looking at things like assaults, in some areas they're going to record those as, the police are going to record that a lot more often than in other areas where the kind of tradition is for the police to show up, two people are fighting, oh, we're just going to break it up and let everybody go home to sleep it off. There's no record of that kept. Thus, if you compare the assault rates in those two areas, the first one's obviously going to have a much higher assault rate, but that not because there's actually more assaults happening, just because they're keeping record of it better, right? And then finally, one of the big difficulties is law versus practice. There are many places where there are certain things that are, legally permitted or legally required or even legally, not banished, legally proscribed. But in practice, that's not the way it really happens, right? So later on, we'll be talking about the death penalty. And there are many states in the United States right now where it's still legal to give a prisoner the death penalty in that state, but they haven't actually done it in 20 or 30 or 40 years. So does that state really have the death penalty? I mean, sure, it's legal to do it there, but they haven't actually done one in longer than I've been alive. So, it kind of depends on what your goal in the comparison is. Whether you want to look at, whether you want to compare different states based on the law, or you want to compare different states based on the practice. And that kind of thing happens all over the place. There are countries where marijuana is technically illegal, but people smoke it all the time in public, and police don't do anything because they don't care. So, especially with certain subjects, there's a vastly different kind of there's a big difference between what the law says should happen and what actually happens, right? So we need to take that into account. So I'm going to end this section with this example, right? A lot of people may not know this, but the UK is actually made up of separate countries. They're kind of sort of one big country, and they're kind of sort of a bunch of smaller countries that are kind of sort of working together and have one queen. Like, it's the really, really weird legal situation. But within the UK, there's England, of course, which is the famous one. And a lot of people use England when they mean the UK, but those are very different things. England is a small country within the UK, which is a larger kind of also a country. But then there's Wales, which is there to the west of England. There's Scotland, which is way up north. And then, of course, there's Northern Ireland, which is the northern tip of a completely different island. And then even with that, you can even add on to that, there's a bunch of very much smaller areas like the Isle of Man and a few others They're skipping my mind right now, but those are the four kind of big ones, right? And England and Wales have one very kind of famous system, right? Especially here in the United States, but also most English-speaking countries. Our criminal justice systems are descended from the criminal justice system of England and Wales, specifically, the UK more in general. So this is kind of the grandfather of probably what most of you are listening to this. I'm assuming most of the people seeing this are from English-speaking countries. Our criminal justice system kind of dates back to England's. And in England and Wales, they have one system, and in Scotland, they have a different system. It's not the same. And it's an even bigger difference, I would argue, than, say, the difference between the Texas legal system and the Oklahoma legal system, right? So, for instance, for one thing, England and Wales have essentially one police force, right? But the police in Scotland are a completely different policing agency. Here in the United States, we have a gazillion policing agencies, so that doesn't seem like that big a deal. But in most of the world, you have either one police agency per country or a very, very small number. So England and Wales and Scotland having a completely different police force is kind of note, I should say. And trials in England and Wales look a lot like trials in the United States. 12 jurors, the judge, the defense, the prosecution. We'll get a lot more deeper into detail about that adversarial system. But there are a few differences between England and Wales and Scotland. So for instance, England and Wales, you've got 12 jurors. Scotland, you've got 15. You also have a different way in which trials can end, right? So here in the United States and in England and Wales, there are two different things the jury can say. At the end of the trial, prosecution's presented their case, defense has presented their case. The jury goes back and it deliberates, and it can come back with one of two kind of decisions. Guilty or not guilty. That's it, right? Either the prosecution proved its case and the defendant is guilty beyond reasonable doubt, or prosecution didn't prove its case and they're not guilty. In Scotland, there's a third option. It's called not proven. And functionally, in the 21st century, it's effectively the same as a not guilty verdict. But it's not quite the same. So in Scotland, it's kind of viewed as more along the lines of guilty means guilty, not guilty means they didn't do it, not proven means we think he might have done it, but you're proving it didn't quite reach the level to say where we were ready to say guilty, right? And again, functionally, it's essentially the same as a not guilty verdict legally, but there's kind of a perception of a difference between not guilty and not proven. I'm sure 200 years ago there was an actual difference, like a legal difference, but I don't know. I am not from England, Wales, or Scotland, but if you are, feel free to message me about it. And then finally, in Scotland, they're lawyers, what we would call a lawyer or an attorney here in the United States. They're also called lawyers or attorney in the UK, but in England and Wales, they're more commonly referred to as barristers, and in Scotland, they're referred to as advocates. So it's like they have a whole different title for what a lawyer or a prosecuting or defense attorney would have. All right, that's the end of section 1. I really appreciate you guys being here. Hopefully I'll see you for section 2.